Hi, young adults. I ran out of time on our last video, so this is Module 61, Part 2. So go ahead and open your notebooks back up to Module 61. The last thing that we're going to talk about from 61 is the principles of test construction, right? So to be widely accepted, these are kind of the three criteria that tests must meet. So the first one that I mentioned in the last video was standardization. The second one is reliability. And the third criteria would be validity. So I started to talk about this idea of standardization in the last video, but I'm going to just kind of go over that again. So standardization is a process of defining meaningful scores relative to a pre-tested group. Kind of think about standardization or to standardize a test. They're kind of like your control group, right? So in order to give an intelligence test to someone and tell them what their score is, you're basing their score against a previous representative sample, right? So you first have to test the test, essentially. You're testing the test on a representative sample of people, right? So you get your representative sample, you can figure out what their average test score is, right? And then once you figure out what the average test score is, you can correlate that to 100 because on intelligence tests, the average is 100, right? So to standardize the test is that you're trying to standardize the scores into forming essentially a normal distribution, right? So a normal distribution is a symmetrical bell curve. So symmetrical meaning 50% of people fall below, 50% fall above the average, and it takes the shape of a bell, right? So to standardize a test, you have to have a group to compare it to. So you would first give the test to a representative sample of people to figure out what the standard is, and then you would then give the test to other people and compare their scores to the representative sample, which is standardization, right? So the normal curve on an intelligence test, the average is 100. To keep the average score near 100, scales will often be re-standardized, right? So they will retest a sample group, right? So they might do one in the 90s, then the early 2000s, and the late 2000s. So to re-standardize it, they would test the score again, find out the average, and then that would be the group, the baseline for comparing test scores to another person who takes it. The Flynn effect, this was an italicized term in your book, is the idea that intelligence test performance has been improving, right? So James Flynn is going to document the idea that intelligence test scores from over 20 different countries found that overall intelligence scores have risen since the beginning of the 1900s. So regardless of your race, ethnicity, or cultural background, on average, people's intelligence scores are rising. So like I mentioned in an earlier video, like the average person's intelligence test score 80 years ago by today's standard would be a 76. So if they took it, 80 years ago, they would have scored 100, but that same score on today's test would actually only be a 76. So the question is why are people as a whole, right? This is across 20 different countries. Why are people scoring higher on intelligence tests as a whole, regardless of your race, ethnicity, or background? So just possible causes. And once again, there's no clear answer. Is it the tests are maybe more sophisticated? Are people having better nutrition, which is leading to better cognitive ability? Is it more education? More stimulating environments that people are in? They're not entirely sure. But the Flynn effect is simply saying that people are performing higher on intelligence tests than previous generations. Okay, so that all comes back to this idea of standardization. The second principle is this idea of reliability, right? So reliability is talking about the extent to which a test yields consistent results. The key word there being consistent, right? So there are kind of two ways that you can test consistency. So let's say on your test that you're going to take in terms of personality, I put like question number 1 on your personality test has to do with Freud's defense mechanism of repression. And then question number 48 also has to do with Freud's concept of repression, right? So maybe one, I'm asking the definition of repression, and maybe, the later question 48 or whatever I said, is asking you like a scenario question, and you have to identify that it is repression. Both of those questions are testing whether or not you understand what repression is. If you were reliable, right? If you really truly understood repression, the idea is that you should get question number 1 and 48 correct, right? If you got question 1 wrong, but you got 48 right, or you got question 1 correct and you got 48 wrong, you only got half of the questions about repression correct, that would indicate a lack of consistency, that maybe you don't know what repression means. So reliability is the consistency, right? So one of the ways that you can test the reliability of a test is it's like test retest. So like I would give you the test on personality, you take it. The next day, I give you another test on personality, right? So essentially you should score relatively the same on both of those tests, right? That's like, that's the retest option, right? So you should have, if consistent results from, if you're taking the same test twice, like relatively speaking, it should be consistent in your score. Or another way that you can test reliability, is using like a split, they call it like a split test, where, there's like the two halves of the test, or ultimate forms of the test. So like kind of think of like two questions that have to do with the same topic that I talked about in terms of repression as another way to decide if something's reliable, right? So so you can retest people using the same or another form of the test, which I talked about, or you could do that like split test piece. The third principle of test construction is this idea of validity. So validity is the extent to which a test measures or predicts what it's supposed to, right? Just because something's highly reliable doesn't mean that it's valid, right? So just because you consistently have consistent results doesn't mean that it's predicting what it's supposed to predict, right? So let's say like you consistently score on your driver's ed test, the written portion, you consistently score, let's say, a 75%. That doesn't, yes, it's reliable, right? Like you took the test, 4 times and you got 75, 78, 77. But does the written portion predict what it's supposed to predict? Like if it's meant to predict how well you can drive, does the written portion actually do that? And some of you might say yes, and some of you might say no. A better predictor would actually be having you get in a car and take an actual driving test, right? So validity is talking about the extent to which a test measures or predicts what it's supposed to predict, okay? Another example of high reliability not ensuring the validity of a test, if you use an inaccurate tape measure to measure someone's height, right? So let's say, it's off by half an inch. Your height report for every single person you measure will be reliable. It'll be consistent, but it's not valid because your tape measure is broken, right? So it's not predicting what it's supposed to predict because your tape measure is half an inch off. And there are those examples right there. I forgot that I put them on the line. So you can read through those two examples as talking about validity. That's exactly what I just went through. Okay. In terms of validity, there are 2 different types. So there's content validity and then there's predictive validity. So content validity is the extent to which a test samples the behavior that is of interest, right? So the idea there is, does the meaning of the test tap into the behavior that you're looking for? So this would be like a road test or an actual driving test for a driver's license. because it's actually sampling the tasks a driver would routinely face. Okay. Another example would be your course exams would have content validity if they assess your mastery of the course material. The other type of validity is predictive validity. Predictive validity is the success with which a test predicts the behavior it is designed to predict. And that's assessed by computing the correlation between the test scores and the criterion behavior. So an aptitude test must have predictive validity. They're supposed to predict your future achievement, right? So what is the ability to predict your future achievement? Does it actually test what it's supposed to? Predictive power of aptitude tests is strong in the early school years, but later on it becomes less effective in terms of its predictive validity. Okay. So this is just going through, looking at the bow and arrow essentially with the target is what I'm trying to say. So is it reliable, valid, both, or neither? So if you're looking at, I don't have the answers on there, which would be a problem. So we will go over those in class because I apparently did not put them up, right? So if you're looking at this one, right, the arrows are clustered together. So in this case, they're consistent, which means it's reliable. But is it predicting your accuracy? Because you're trying to hit the center of the target. So the answer, it's not valid, right? It's reliable, but not valid. In this case, the arrows are everywhere. So it's not reliable. And you could argue that it's not valid because it's not predicting your accuracy per se. This would be both consistency because they're all clustered together. So it's reliable. It's also valid because it's trying to test your actual ability to hit the bullseye. Okay, so that's kind of a little rundown. You didn't read Module 62, but 62 talks about the dynamics of intelligence. So this is kind of just a little review. We talked about this with development, but crystallized intelligence is talking about your accumulated knowledge, so how much information you've learned along with your verbal skills. This increases as you get older, right? So it's like kind of with age comes knowledge. Fluid intelligence is talking about your abstract reasoning, your processing speed, and your reasoning speed. Typically, as you get older, fluid intelligence is going to decrease. And I think of like playing video games where like older people are maybe less coordinated. They're not thinking through the different things that are popping up in the game as quickly. That's more of your fluid intelligence. Okay. In terms of extremes of intelligence, the low extremes, people who are on the low extremes of intelligence are referred to having or could potentially have an intellectual disability. This is an older term. It's not socially appropriate. But in our old textbook, it was called mental retardation. So you might see that on your AP test. The low extreme of and having a severe intellectual disability, it's when people score lower than a 70 or below on an intelligence test, and they struggle with adapting to the quote-unquote normal demands of independent living. Typically speaking, we're talking about 1% of the population. Males are going to outnumber females by 50%. So in terms of the low disability side, you're going to see way more males than females. Also talking about the low extreme would be people who suffer from or diagnosed with Down syndrome, which is a condition of, once again, retardation is not an appropriate word to be using. So it's people who suffer with a mental or cognitive disability that's also associated with physical disorders because they have an extra chromosome. So people who are diagnosed with Down syndrome have 47 chromosomes as opposed to the 46 that other people have. Okay. We're going to skip that. The high extreme would be like people who are gifted. Sometimes you see this with tracking. This is where you have like honors AP. So the con of tracking people into classes based on their aptitude is it can create a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you think about it, like our lowest tracked classes, which are typically survey classes at our higher school, are consistently made up of students of color. So if you understand that intelligence is not based on race, right, then where are the people who are of low intelligence or low cognitive ability who are white in our survey classes? Like, where are those people? Part of it is the self-fulfilling prophecy where they're opting up and moving into higher level classes. Okay, that's the end.